On a Tuesday morning in December, I opened the collection box on Ashford Lane and found an envelope addressed to "My friend who found the letters." I stood at the box for a moment with the envelope in my hand. The handwriting was a child's. Careful, slightly uneven, the letters formed with the specific effort of someone who had been taught that writing was worth doing correctly. I had seen this handwriting every Tuesday for 14 weeks. I knew it the way I knew everything on my route. Not because I had studied it, but because I had been paying attention. For the first 12 of those weeks, the handwriting had addressed the envelopes to Mom, Heaven. The last 2 weeks, it had addressed them to me. I put the envelope in my mailbag. I finished the route. I drove back to the post office and signed out and drove home and sat at the kitchen table and did not open it until June came home from school at 3:15. She was 9 years old. She walked in with her backpack and her boots still on, which I had asked her not to do 100 times, and she saw me at the table and she said, "Was there one today?" I held up the envelope. She sat down across from me, boots still on, backpack still on her back. She said, "Open it." I opened it. I read it. June said, "What does it say?" I looked at the letter, the careful handwriting of an 8-year-old boy who had been writing to his dead mother in heaven for 14 months, and who had, for the past 8 weeks, been writing to a stranger who had written back. I said, "He wants to meet." June said, "Are you going to?" I looked at the letter. I thought about the first time I had found one of his letters in the box on Ashford Lane, the Tuesday morning in August when I had pulled it from the collected mail and read the address and understood what I was looking at and felt, in the specific way you feel things that remind you of your own life, that this was something I was supposed to pay attention to. I said, "Yes." June said, "Good." She stood up and finally took off her backpack and her boots, in that order, and went to the kitchen for a snack. I sat at the table with the letter. I had not expected any of this. I had not expected the first letter, or the decision to write back, or the 8 weeks of correspondence with a child I had never met, or this, a December morning on a mail route in Cedar Falls, Iowa, holding an envelope from an 8-year-old boy addressed to "My friend who found the letters," and knowing that yes was the only possible answer. Let me tell you how we got here. I grew up in Cedar Falls, in the same neighborhood where I still lived, 4 blocks from my mother Rosa's house, on streets I had been walking since before I could walk them alone. Cedar Falls was the kind of mid-size Midwestern city that was not famous for anything in particular and that held the people who stayed in it with the specific loyalty of a place that did not promise more than it delivered. I had stayed. I had not thought much about whether to stay. It was where I was from and where I knew how to be from, and that had been sufficient. My father died when I was 11. My mother had raised me and my sister in the house 4 blocks away and had kept the neighborhood's knowledge of us. Tom is working at the post office now. Tom got married. Tom had a little girl. Updated through the specific social infrastructure of a Midwestern neighborhood that had not changed much in 40 years. I had worked for USPS since I was 23 years old. Started as a sorter, moved to carrier work in 2005 at 27. I had been walking variations of the same routes in Cedar Falls for 17 years. I knew my customers the way I knew my own house, not consciously but completely, the way you know things that have become the rhythm of your days. Who was home and who wasn't, who had a new baby, whose mother had moved in. The mail told you a great deal about the lives behind the doors if you were paying attention, and I had been paying attention for 17 years. I met Laura in 2008. We married in 2012. June was born in 2014. Laura died in March 2020 from a massive stroke. She was 37 years old, no prior symptoms, a Wednesday morning. June was 5 years old. I took 3 weeks. Then I came back because June needed me and the route needed walking and the days needed their rhythm. Rhythm was what June and I both needed in the first year when Laura's absence was everywhere, and the only thing that helped was the structure of ordinary time. June was 9 now, pragmatic and warm, and with the specific quality of a child who had grown up watching her father pay attention to people, and who had absorbed this as a way of being in the world. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. She had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them, which Rosa said was exactly like her mother, and exactly like me, and therefore inevitable. Rosa knew about the letters too. She was at the other end of the kitchen table most evenings when June and I read them, and she had opinions about what I wrote back, which she expressed in the way Rosa expressed everything, directly and without being asked. She had been following the correspondence from the beginning with the specific attention of a woman who had raised a son who paid attention and who recognized the quality of the thing he had gotten himself into. I had been thinking about grief differently since Laura died, not as a problem to be solved or a process to be completed, but as a permanent feature of the landscape, something that changed shape over time but did not leave. I had talked about it with a counselor, with Rosa, with June. In the specific, honest way I had decided from the beginning was the only way to talk about it with a child who deserved the truth. I had not expected to talk about it through letters to a child I had never met. The first letter had appeared in the collection box on Ashford Lane in the last week of August 2023. I had not noticed it specifically at first, a small envelope with a child's handwriting, addressed to Mom, Heaven. I had included it with the undeliverable mail. It had gone through the process. That had been that. The second had appeared the following Tuesday, the third the Tuesday after. By the fourth week I had noticed the pattern. Every Tuesday, a letter in the same handwriting, addressed to the same destination. I had begun to look for them. I had begun to feel their absence on the days they were not there. I had not read them. I had wanted to, not from curiosity but from the specific impulse of someone who could feel the weight of something and wanted to know what it weighed. But they were sealed. I had no right. I had let them go through the process for 6 weeks before anything changed. What changed was a Tuesday morning in October when I opened the collection box and found the latest letter with its envelope flap slightly unsealed, the gum having dried out, the way it does on envelopes that sit in a drawer too long before being used. The letter inside had shifted. The first line was visible without opening the envelope. I read it before I could decide not to. Dear Mom, I'm writing again because Dad said you can't write back, but I think if you could, you would. I closed the envelope. I put it with the undeliverable mail. I walked the rest of my route thinking about a child who understood, at 8 years old, that the letters would not be answered, and who wrote them anyway, who kept writing because the alternative to writing was silence, and silence was too heavy to carry alone. I had been that child. Not with letters. I had been 11 when my father died, and I had not written letters. I had gone very quiet for a long time, and my mother had sat beside me in it until I came back. But I understood the logic of it. The logic that said if I keep reaching, maybe something will reach back. The logic that said the love that goes out has to go somewhere. That evening, after June was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. I wrote it 3 times. Not because I did not know what to say, but because I knew what not to say. I was not Claire. I was not going to pretend to be Claire, or suggest that his letters had reached her, or give Oliver, I did not know his name yet, any comfort that was not true. I was going to be honest about who I was, and I was going to say only what I actually knew. I wrote, Dear friend, I am not your mother. I am a man who delivers mail on your street. I have not read your letters, only the first line of one, by accident, when the envelope came open. But I have been watching your letters arrive every Tuesday for weeks, and I wanted you to know that someone has been here every time one came. Your mother can't write back, I know that, but I thought you deserved to know that someone noticed. Someone saw that you kept writing. I'm not going to pretend to be anything I'm not. I'm just the man who carries the mail on your street and who found your letters and thought you should know they didn't go completely unnoticed. A friend who found your letters. I left it in the collection box the following morning. I did not know if Oliver checked that box. I did not know if his father checked it, or a housekeeper, or nobody at all. I left the letter and walked the rest of the route and did not allow myself to expect anything. The following Tuesday, Oliver wrote back. His first response was in the collection box when I opened it on a Tuesday morning, a week after I had left my letter. I recognized the handwriting. I put it in my mailbag and finished the route and went home and opened it at the kitchen table that evening with June beside me. She had found out about the correspondence 3 days after I had left my first letter. She had come into the kitchen while I was writing the second draft and had read over my shoulder and had said, "Who is that for?" And I had told her, and she had sat down and said, "Read me the whole thing." I read her the whole thing. She had been beside me at the kitchen table for every letter since. Rosa had been at the other end. Oliver's first response, "Dear friend who found the letters. How did you know I was writing? Do you have the other letters? Please don't throw them away. My mom died last year. Her name was Claire. She had hair that was the color of the leaves in fall, and she smelled like the soap she used that was in a blue bottle. I write to her because if I don't write, then I am the only one who remembers what she smelled like, and that's too much for just one person. Who are you? Oliver, age 8. June read the letter beside me. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's scared nobody else remembers." I said, "Yes." She said, "Write back tonight." I wrote back that night. I told Oliver I had not kept the other letters. They had gone through the mail system and I did not have them, and I was sorry about that. I told him that Claire sounded like someone specific and real, and that the details he had given, the hair, the soap, the blue bottle, were the most important kind of details to keep, because they were the ones that were true in a way that photographs were not. I asked him how old he was and whether he had anyone to talk to about his mother. He was 8. He had a father and a therapist and a school counselor. He had, as of the previous week, a friend who found his letters. He preferred the friend. We wrote for 8 weeks. I want to tell you what those 8 weeks contained because the letters are the story and the summary of them is not sufficient. We wrote about Claire's laugh, big and specific, the kind of laugh that took up space in a room, that Oliver could make happen by doing a particular impression of a character from a television show she had liked. We wrote about the last breakfast she had made him, French toast with too much cinnamon, which Oliver had not liked at the time and would give anything to eat again. We wrote about a photograph he had on his nightstand, Claire at the beach, squinting into the sun, not posed, caught in the middle of something. We wrote about his father Edward. Oliver wrote about Edward with the specific, careful love of a child who understood that his father was also grieving, and who also understood that his father was not there in the ways Oliver needed him to be there. He did not say this unkindly. He said it the way children report facts, without judgment, just true. Dad works a lot. I think it helps him not to be sad, but it doesn't help me. I wrote about Laura, not immediately, but as the correspondence developed the specific quality of trust that develops between people who are honest with each other, I wrote about her. The way she organized the refrigerator in a system that made complete sense to her and no sense to me. The song she sang off-key in the car, the space on the left side of the bed on Tuesday mornings when I woke up and had half a second before I remembered, and then remembered. June contributed without her name being attached for the first 5 weeks. She sat beside me and said things at the kitchen table that were so precisely right that I wrote them into the letters. Oliver received them as Tom's understanding. Tom knew they were June's. In the 5th week I told Oliver about June. I said I had a daughter who was 9 years old and who had lost her mother when she was 5, and who had been beside me at the kitchen table for every letter of this correspondence, and who had contributed to some of them, with her own significant opinions. Oliver wrote back, "What's her name?" Tom wrote back, "June." Oliver wrote back, "June is a good name. Tell her I said thank you." I showed June the letter. She read it. She said, "Tell him you're welcome." I wrote, "June says you're welcome." In the 7th week, Oliver asked who I was. Not my name. Who I was. What kind of person found letters in a mailbox and wrote back. I wrote back, "I deliver mail. That is my job. I walk the streets of this city 5 days a week and deliver the mail and pay attention to the people whose doors I pass. I noticed your letters because I look for things that matter, and your letters mattered. I know about losing someone. My daughter was 5 when her mother died. She's 9 now. The grief doesn't go away, I've told you this, but it changes. It gets quieter, not better. Quieter. There is more room around it after a while. I am not a counselor or a therapist. I am a man who walks a route and noticed a child who kept writing when nobody was writing back. I thought that deserved an answer. Your friend." He wrote back the following Tuesday. "Can I meet you?" I sat with this for 2 days. I talked to June. June said, "You have to say yes. You can't say no to that." I talked to Rosa. Rosa said, "Tom, say yes." I wrote back, yes. What I had not anticipated was that Oliver had shown the letters to his father. Edward Ashford had known about the correspondence for 3 weeks. Oliver had told him about it in the 5th week, shown him the letters, explained the mailbox on the corner. Edward had read them carefully and had sat with them for a long time and had called USPS and identified the route and found my supervisor's contact information and called and said, "I want to find the man who wrote these letters to my son. I want to thank him." My supervisor had called me on a Thursday morning. Edward Ashford came to the post office on a Friday afternoon in December. I was finishing the day's paperwork when my supervisor brought Edward to the break room. He was 52 years old and wearing the clothes of someone who had money and who wore them without emphasis, the specific quality of a person who had enough that it no longer required demonstration. He had the look of a man who was managing something difficult with careful composure. He stood when I came in. He said, "Are you Tom?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm Oliver's father." He held out his hand. I shook it. He said, "I've read the letters." I said, "I should probably tell you I'm sorry for stepping into something private." He said, "Don't." He sat back down. He put his hands on the table. For 18 months I hired every professional available to help my son. Grief counselors, play therapists, a program in Chicago that came highly recommended, art therapy, everything appropriate. He stopped. Oliver went through all of it. He came home on Tuesdays and wrote letters to the mailbox. I said, "I know." He said, "He showed me your letters in November. I read them." He paused. "The one where you talked about the space on the left side of the bed." Another pause. "I have been working very hard not to understand that one." I said, "Yes." He said, "I understood it." I looked at him. Edward Ashford was a man who had built a business and a house and a life, and who had lost the person who made all of it mean something, and who had been trying for 18 months to solve that problem with the same tools that had built everything else, and who was sitting now across from a mail carrier in a post office break room because his 8-year-old son had been writing to heaven and a stranger had written back. I said, "He's a remarkable child." Edward said, "Yes, he is." A pause. "He would like to meet you. Both of you." He asked specifically about June. I said, "June has been following the correspondence very closely." He said, "I gathered. The letter about keeping specific details, the one about the blue bottle and the soap being more important than photographs." I didn't think a 45-year-old man wrote that. I said, "She was sitting across the table." He said, "Oliver would like to meet June." I said, "June would like to meet Oliver." We looked at each other across the break room table. A mail carrier and a real estate developer, 2 men in their 40s who had lost their wives and who were raising children alone, and who had arrived in this room from different parts of the same city carrying the same weight. Edward said, "What made you write back?" I said, "I read the first line, by accident." He said, "If you could write back, you would." Edward said, "Claire would have written back." I said, "I know. That's why I did." On a Saturday morning in December, we walked to the park 2 blocks from my house. Cedar Falls in December, cold and specific, the stillness of a Midwestern winter morning when the snow had not yet arrived, but the air held the quality of something waiting. The park was quiet. The swings were moving slightly in the wind, the empty ones, the way swings move when they remember being occupied. Edward and Oliver were already there when June and I arrived. Oliver was on a swing. Edward was standing nearby with the specific quality of a father watching his child be a child rather than a grief patient, the quality of a man who was learning, belatedly and with difficulty, what that looked like. Oliver was 8 years old. He had his mother's hair, the color of leaves in fall, and the watchful eyes of a child who had been paying careful attention to the world for a long time and had found the world worthy of that attention. June saw him. She walked to the swings without pausing and sat in the one beside him and said something I could not hear from where I was standing. Oliver said something back. They began to swing. Edward came to stand beside me. We stood in the December morning watching our children. After a while he said, "What are you going to do about the letters, going forward?" I said, "That's up to Oliver." He said, "He told me he doesn't need to write to the mailbox anymore." I said, "Good." He said he has someone to write to now. I looked at June on the swing beside Oliver. She was saying something specific, and Oliver was listening with the complete attention of a child receiving information he intended to retain. I said, "So does June." Rosa had given June a letter that morning before we left, her own letter, written on the notepad from her kitchen counter, addressed to June's friend Oliver. She had been sitting at the other end of the kitchen table through 8 weeks of this correspondence, following every word, and had decided she had something to say and had said it in the way Rosa said everything, without being asked and without apology. June had put it in her jacket pocket. I had not read it. Some things were between them, and that was exactly right. Edward looked at his son on the swing. He said, "Thank you." I said, "He did the work. He kept writing when nobody was writing back." Edward said, "You wrote back." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I looked at the swings. My daughter and Oliver, the December morning, the specific ordinary thing of 2 children swinging side by side in a park while their fathers stood on the grass and watched. I said, because he said if she could write back she would, and I thought, someone should. Edward looked at his son. He looked at his son's face, the specific face of a child who was, for this moment, on a swing in December in Cedar Falls, talking to a girl named June. Not a grief patient or a clinical case or a child to be managed, but simply a boy who had written letters and found someone who wrote back. He said, "Yes." Just that. The swings moved. The December air held its waiting. The park was quiet around us, and the 2 children who had both lost someone swung side by side in the cold morning light, talking about something neither of their fathers could hear, which was exactly right. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a moment when someone noticed you, really noticed you, when you were carrying something heavy and thought no one could see, and did something small because of it that changed something for you? It doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it's a letter. Sometimes it's just someone being in the right place at the right time and choosing to pay attention. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.